I'm going to start actually with a tweet from former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, who basically said, let me get this straight. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent meets with a private group of large investors to give them the benefit of his thoughts on trade. Summers says that seems very unfair and the kind of stuff that happens in a world of crony capitalism.
Yeah, material, non-public information. That's what they call it there. The fact that he's speaking to this audience, that they know they're going to disseminate this information very quickly and act on it. And that's exactly what happened. If you looked at the intraday chart of the S&P 500, it kind of took a leg higher. I think one of the things that's also very confusing, and, the rhetoric back and forth, it's not just the tariff trade stuff, but it's also the Fed and what they might do there. This is only going to get dialed up as we get to May 7th. That's the next time Fed Chair Powell speaks with all the other Fed governors. They're going to make a rate decision here. I just can't imagine what, the president had to say to Eamon Javers from CNBC after the close, understanding that is going to be widely disseminated. It's going to be further upward momentum for the market, that is going to be the last say about this as we get into the lead up into May 7th. And so to me, the markets better hold in. Investors better not get yippy, as a term that I don't know if you've ever heard that before.
Never.
I heard that on April
Yippee,
9th here,
yes.
Because that rhetoric is going to get dialed up once again by the president.
Okay, but here's the thing. We've been hearing from this White House, specifically Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, it's not Wall Street's turn. It's Main Street's turn. And I just want to reiterate again what happened. In a room of private investors, large hedge funds, money managers, pension funds, the Treasury Secretary expresses his views on what's happening with the China trade war. The market soars. And 4 hours later, the president basically backs up what he says and kind of talks nice to China, showing signs of capitulation with giving us no information on what China would give us. So take me to Main Street. Whether it's the mainstream investor that doesn't get, Mr. 401k that doesn't get that information, or a business leader. There's not one business leader, there's not one small business in America that was privy to what Scott Bessent was saying in that room. And even if they were, none of that are actually any concrete advancements.
As my colleagues at Bloomberg reported, this was a small meeting, as you say, a very exclusive group meeting with the Treasury Secretary on the sidelines of the IMF and World Bank meetings in D.C. So this was pretty rarefied air inside this conference room. And you're exactly right. It was restricted to that group. The question remains, how on earth does this benefit Main Street? So we've seen, this is the latest example of it, these kind of whiplash moments where the market has sagged incredibly, and then with an utterance from the president or one of his aides, another official from the administration, suddenly it's up again. To have some insight into when that's going to happen or how that's going to happen would be incredibly powerful and quite lucrative. I'm not suggesting that was the case widely here, but it's just a fact of the matter that we have seen this market rise and fall moment to moment over these last many weeks, and that's an incredibly notable thing, and I would imagine a worrisome thing to a lot of people as well.
But does the White House run the risk that they lose their credibility, that they become the boy who cried wolf? Because, even what Bessent said in that meeting today wasn't that monumental. We don't know if they're right. They haven't actually hashed out any deal, and the market went up almost 1,000 points. At some point, is the market going to say, I don't believe you? Or is the White House trying to teach the market a lesson? Don't you short the market in my face, because I could come out with an announcement based on truth or lies at any moment.
I think they have less teeth the more that you do it. And I think we know from Trump 1.0 that he's not particularly a great negotiator. If you think about 2018, when they slapped some of the first tariffs on China, it took 2 years. They didn't even get to phase one until January of 2020. And so when you think about, saying the quiet part out loud, which is what they always do, the Chinese are just kind of sitting back. And they're just kind of letting the markets push the White House around. They're waiting to see what he's going to say. And, the other thing is that the Chinese are also saying, wait a minute, why hasn't Japan? Why hasn't Mexico? Why hasn't the EU? Why hasn't Canada done a deal? We're going to sit around and wait for it. And I just want to make one other point. You just mentioned Main Street and you mentioned 401ks. And I don't know if you noticed this morning.
101ks now.
Yeah. Well, so two huge government contractors. These are two great American companies, Northrop Grumman and Raytheon, which is now RTX. Okay, these are both nearly 100-year-old companies. They get a disproportionate amount of their sales from the U.S. government. They were both down 10% today. Why? Because they are taking earnings hits on tariffs. Plain and simple. That's what their CEO said. The stocks got sold off 10%. If you were a shareholder of those companies, if you have it in your 401k, if you were in a profit sharing plan, or however you do, if you work at those companies, your holdings are down 10% because of a policy that the president has not even articulated much about yet. And these are two great American companies that are right involved in our defense apparatus here. So I think there's just lots of collateral damage that's going on here that I think is kind of underreported.
Well, here's what and I'm glad you did. Here's what our Treasury Secretary articulated today. He also told investors that a goal of negotiations would be rebalancing the Chinese economy towards consumption and the U.S. economy towards manufacturing. No duh. I mean, how is that moving the needle? Like, great idea. Sure, we all agree with that. Is any of that realistic? And are we even 1 inch closer to that nirvana than we were 2 weeks ago before trillions in market cap were wiped out?
No, we're not. And
No.
And I've been on here many times. We've talked about the fact that there's nothing that comes after the implementation of these tariffs. There's no plan for what happens next. And there is plenty of happy talk from members of the cabinet about how manufacturing is going to come back. We don't know what that's going to look like, what they think it's going to look like. But to get to that kind of rebalancing that Scott Bessent is talking about would take an incredibly long time. Might not even be possible for that to happen. And just to pick up on what you're saying, look at how long it took to come to those deals during the first term. We have an administration now that says it's trying to broker these deals with 60 countries simultaneously. And you just look at the way they're talking about these deals as they kind of come into focus. And there are memorandums of understanding and there are frameworks of an agreement. They aren't concrete deals. And I'm very curious, and you would know this better than I, if that's going to be enough for Wall Street to know that it's good enough that these countries are just talking to one another, or if when push comes to shove, what really needs to happen is something has to be inked, that's many years off from today.
It could be good enough for Wall Street because traders can trade on anything, right? They're not making a long-term commitment.
Yeah.
Who it's not good for are businesses that actually have to make long-term decisions. Somebody can go in and out of a stock in a millisecond. It means nothing. But let's talk about the Fed Chair, Jay Powell, because a cynic or a skeptic would say, Donald Trump hasn't changed his opinion of Jay Powell. Potentially nothing's happened with China. But they woke up this morning after a disastrous day in the markets yesterday when the president signaling he wants to get rid of Jay Powell and nothing's happening on trade.
Whom he picked, by the way.
Whom he picked.
Yes.
And suddenly, I don't want to get rid of Jay Powell. And maybe things are moving forward with China. But let's say Donald Trump were to get his wish, right? He's saying he doesn't want to get rid of him. But let's be honest. Let's say Jay Powell's gone. If Jay Powell were to leave his post and Trump could get that done, there's a huge group of super qualified people who could be Fed chair. But the next Fed chair who would take that position after Jay Powell would be saying, yes, the Fed is no longer independent. Donald Trump is the boss. Would that not completely compromise the Fed, even if you had a superstar in that position?
Yeah, it would undermine their credibility, right? It's meant to be independent. And, you know, one thing that's really important, you could say he could try to kind of swing his magic wand and get rid of Jay Powell. Powell's already said that he's not leaving. You know, like if he tries to fire him, he's going to take this to the court, and this thing could go to the Supreme Court. We've used this term, a constitutional crisis, you know, in the Trump administration, both 1 and 2.0 for a while. This thing could be that. And it looks like this Supreme Court, to be very clear, doesn't seem like they want to roll over. They seem like they're the last line of defense a little bit. So Powell's not leaving. If he tries to fire him and they have this sort of standoff, that would be a disaster for global markets, not just our markets. We got a little bit of a preview of that yesterday.
He's also not the sole decider, right? He would just level down to be a Fed governor. Like Jay Powell is more like the jury foreman, right? You've got, what is Trump going to do? Take out every possible Fed governor who might disagree with him? That's not really possible.